Hey everyone. If you're looking for a story that makes you question the true cost of perfection and the unexpected paths to love, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments below where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always exciting to see who's joining us from around the world. The marble prison. The morning light filtered through the enormous windows overlooking the perfectly manicured garden, illuminating the look of disgust on the millionaire's face as he held a burnt piece of toast between his fingers, evidence of the culinary disaster he had just witnessed in his state-of-the-art kitchen. With a dismissive gesture, he tossed the charred bread into the bin and, without a word, extended a check to the chef who looked at him nervously, communicating with that simple gesture that his services were no longer required at Belmont Manor. This made him the 5th chef dismissed so far this year. With a sigh of annoyance, Arthur Belmont picked up his phone and dialed the staffing agency, demanding an immediate replacement. Yet another employee who would pass in and out of his life without leaving a trace. Another face he would forget as soon as they crossed the exit door. The afternoon light faded over London when the mansion's doorbell announced the arrival of the new cook. Isabel Silva stepped through the main door with a confidence that contrasted sharply with the usual submission of those entering Arthur Belmont's employ, carrying not only her professional portfolio, but also her prominently pregnant belly, revealing at least 6 months of gestation. The woman's gaze swept over the minimalist foyer, showing no surprise at the obvious signs of opulence adorning every corner. From original paintings by contemporary artists to crystal sculptures that reflected light in 1,000 different directions. "So you are Mr. Belmont," she said with a soft but firm accent, extending her hand in a professional gesture that didn't ask permission but demanded respect, something Arthur was unaccustomed to, especially from someone there to serve him. Her resume was impeccable. Studies at the best culinary schools, experience in Michelin-starred restaurants, and references that spoke of her exceptional culinary talent. However, none of that was what captivated Arthur's attention in that first encounter. It was her swollen belly that drew the millionaire's gaze like a magnet, provoking in him a visceral and inexplicable reaction, a mix of curiosity, fascination, and a strange kind of attraction he had never before experienced in the presence of a pregnant woman. Arthur was momentarily speechless, a very rare phenomenon for a man accustomed to dominating any conversation, while his eyes remained fixed on that evidence of life Isabel carried with her, as if it were a mystery he needed to unravel, or a particularly complex puzzle he couldn't solve. Time seemed to stop in that ultra-modern but cold kitchen where stainless steel appliances gleamed with surgical cleanliness, silent witnesses to that encounter that would change both their lives, more than either could imagine at that moment. Isabel, accustomed to the curious and even uncomfortable glances her condition provoked, immediately noticed Arthur's fixation and, far from appearing embarrassed or uncomfortable, held his gaze with a hint of defiance in her dark eyes, as if she were expecting exactly the kind of reaction he was having. The silence grew thick between them, charged with a tension Arthur couldn't interpret, until words finally burst from his mouth, without passing through his usual filter of political correctness he used in his business, formulating a tremendously inappropriate question for a first interview. "Does your husband allow you to work while pregnant?" The question floated in the air like an involuntary confession of his most primitive thoughts, revealing more about him than about the woman in front of him, exposing his prejudices and his inability to comprehend female independence, especially in a condition that he, in his privileged ignorance, considered limiting. Arthur regretted his words the moment they left his mouth, but it was too late. The question was there, suspended between them like a tangible offense, and he could only wait for the indignant reaction that would surely follow, mentally preparing himself for another hiring process the next day. However, what he got was an enigmatic smile that barely curved the corners of Isabel's lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which remained sharp and penetrating like daggers when she replied, "My husband betrayed me and abandoned me, so I allow myself to work." The words, spoken in Portuguese, resonated with a force that transcended language, communicating not just a fact, but a declaration of principles, a display of her strength and determination that left Arthur momentarily defenseless, unable to resort to his usual arsenal of sarcasm or condescension. She continued looking him directly in the eyes, without a hint of shame or weakness, awaiting his next move in that strange power game that had just begun between them. A game for which Arthur, despite all his millions and his experience in the world's most competitive boardrooms, was completely unprepared. Arthur Belmont, the man who had disarmed the toughest executives in multi-million-dollar negotiations, who had broken hearts across 3 continents without batting an eye, who never allowed anyone to have the last word in any conversation, found himself unexpectedly disarmed before this woman who so easily put him in his place. It wasn't just her direct answer that had thrown him off, but the certainty in her eyes, the dignity with which she held her situation, so different from the self-pity or desperation he would have expected from someone in her circumstances. "The kitchen is fully equipped," he finally said, abruptly changing the subject. An unusual gesture for him, who always controlled the pace and direction of every interaction. "I hope you find everything you need to start tomorrow." And with those words, Arthur Belmont retreated from his own kitchen, feeling strangely like an intruder, carrying with him a sense of unease he couldn't identify, wondering what it was about this woman that had destabilized him so easily, and why. Against all logic, he felt so drawn to her. Isabel watched him walk away with a mix of disdain and professional curiosity, silently evaluating her new employer while unconsciously caressing her belly. In a protective gesture, she repeated dozens of times a day without realizing it. She didn't need Arthur Belmont's job. She had offers from prestigious restaurants that would be willing to wait until after her delivery. But there was something about the challenge of taming this arrogant millionaire that she found irresistible. An opportunity to prove that her worth as a professional transcended her status as a soon-to-be single mother. With a sigh of determination, she began to familiarize herself with the kitchen, where she would spend the next few weeks or months, depending on how long it took Arthur to show his true nature, or how long it took her to get bored of this game. Never imagining that what had begun as a simple temporary job would become much more, forever altering the course of 2 lives that, until that moment, seemed destined never to cross paths. What do you think will be the biggest challenge for Isabel and Arthur in their new dynamic? Will Arthur's curiosity about her pregnancy deepen his unexpected attraction? Share your predictions in the comments below. The unseen connection. The kitchen, with its Italian marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances, had always been for Arthur Belmont an alien space within his own mansion, a territory he visited only to give orders or express his dissatisfaction with a dish that failed to meet his impossible standards. However, during Isabel's first week of work, the kitchen had inexplicably become the place he most wanted to be, inventing increasingly elaborate excuses to appear there several times a day, checking supposed problems with the ventilation system, or requesting detailed reports on the wine inventory that would accompany his meals. What began as fleeting curiosity had transformed into an almost compulsive need to observe her while she worked, fascinated by the grace with which she moved despite her pregnancy, by the concentration reflected in her face when she tasted sauces or adjusted seasonings, and especially by that soft humming that escaped her lips when she thought no one was listening, an unknown melody Arthur found himself trying to memorize. She seemed perfectly aware of his presence, even when her back was turned, as if she had a sixth sense that alerted her every time he crossed the kitchen threshold. But she rarely interrupted her tasks to acknowledge him, forcing him to initiate any conversation, thus reversing the power dynamic Arthur was accustomed to. That Sunday morning, Arthur entered the kitchen pretending to look for coffee, though the real reason was that irrepressible need to see her. He couldn't explain to himself that attraction that went beyond the physical and deeply disconcerted him. Isabel was preparing breakfast, her dark hair pulled back in a makeshift bun from which some rebellious strands escaped, framing a face that needed no makeup to be striking, a face Arthur had begun to seek even in his dreams. Without looking up from the pan where eggs were slowly cooking, she seemed to sense his presence, though she made no gesture to indicate it, continuing her precise movements as if she were completely alone. Arthur, unable to bear the thought of being ignored, broke the silence with a comment he intended to be casual, but which emerged with a more imperative tone than he would have wished. "I hope you know I like my eggs perfectly cooked." His words hung in the air as he watched Isabel's back tense slightly before she barely turned her face to look at him over her shoulder, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you know I'm not your nanny," she replied, without losing her composure, turning back to the pan to continue her task, adding almost as a reflection to herself, but loud enough for him to hear, "A grown man should know how to cook his own eggs." The comment, delivered with apparent lightness, yet laden with a thinly veiled critique of his dependence and privilege, provoked in Arthur a mix of irritation and something harder to define, a reluctant respect for someone who dared to speak to him without the usual reverence everyone around him professed. It was precisely that lack of deference that kept him returning to the kitchen day after day, that feeling that to Isabel, he wasn't the powerful millionaire Arthur Belmont, but simply another man, a person whose money didn't guarantee him special treatment, nor excused him from behaving with the same basic courtesy expected of anyone else. "Perhaps you should teach me someday," he replied, surprising himself with a proposal he would never have made to any other employee, an invitation to cross that invisible line he always kept between himself and those who worked for him. The silence that followed his words was interrupted by a sudden hiss and a gasp. Isabel had accidentally brushed the edge of the hot pan, burning her hand in a moment of carelessness, perhaps brought on by surprise at his comment. Without thinking twice, Arthur moved with a speed he didn't know he possessed, reaching her in 2 strides and taking her injured hand in his to guide it under the cold running water of the tap. The sensation of her skin against his unleashed an electric current that coursed through his entire body, making him for an instant forget where they were and why he had taken her hand in the first place, conscious only of the contact between them and the strange intimacy of the moment. The water ran over Isabel's reddened skin as Arthur kept his fingers around her wrist, holding her hand under the stream with a delicacy that contrasted with his usual abruptness, sensing the accelerated pulse beneath his fingers and wondering if it was a consequence of pain or something more. Isabel slowly looked up to meet Arthur's eyes, which watched her with disconcerting intensity, as if he were trying to decipher a particularly complex enigma. For a moment, time seemed to stop in that kitchen bathed in morning light, filtering through the large windows, transforming the ordinary into something magical, turning 2 strangers into something indefinable that still had no name, but was already beginning to take shape in the space they shared. Neither dared to break the silence, fearful perhaps that words would dissipate that unexpected connection that had formed between them, that invisible bridge that for a brief instant had eliminated all the differences that separated them, employer and employee, rich and working class, man and pregnant woman. Arthur's fingers lingered a second longer than necessary around Isabel's wrist, unconsciously tracing small circles on her skin. A gesture of comfort that had not been calculated, but arose spontaneously, revealing a facet of himself he rarely showed to others. When they finally separated, Arthur experienced an unfamiliar sensation, a protective impulse he had never before felt towards anyone, much less towards an employee he barely knew. He found himself genuinely concerned for her well-being, wondering if the baby would be all right, if she would need to see a doctor, or if she should take the rest of the day off to recover from the burn. These thoughts, so alien to his usual self-centeredness, deeply disturbed him, forcing him to take a step back, both physically and emotionally, hastily rebuilding the barriers that for a moment had fallen between them. "You should be more careful," he said with a tone he intended to be professional, but which sounded more concerned than he would have liked. "We don't want accidents in the kitchen." And without waiting for an answer, he hastily left, leaving a bewildered Isabel looking alternately at the door he had disappeared through and her own hand, where she still seemed to feel the contact of Arthur's fingers. The rest of the day passed with a strange apparent normalcy, as if both had tacitly agreed to ignore what had happened that morning, a silent truce that allowed them to continue with their respective roles without having to face the implications of that shared moment. Arthur locked himself in his office, pretending to work, though his mind returned again and again to the kitchen, to the sensation of Isabel's skin beneath his fingers, to the momentary vulnerability he had glimpsed in her always defiant eyes. He didn't understand why he felt so drawn to her pregnancy, to that developing life she carried with her, when he had always considered children to have no place in his cosmopolitan and carefree lifestyle. Perhaps it was the novelty, he told himself, the curiosity for something he had never experienced up close, or perhaps it was simply a physical manifestation of his attraction to her, an extension of the desire he felt when he watched her move through his kitchen as if it belonged to her. However, deep within himself, Arthur knew there was something more, something he dared not name, but which began to grow within him with the same silent constancy with which Isabel's child grew. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Isabel meticulously prepared dinner, striving to concentrate on the ingredients and recipes instead of the insistent memory of Arthur's hands holding hers, of the genuine concern she had detected in his gaze before he regained his facade of indifference. She told herself that she shouldn't confuse a simple gesture of basic humanity with something more significant, that he probably would have reacted the same way with anyone who had burned themselves in his presence, that attributing deeper intentions to him would be a mistake she couldn't afford to make, not after everything she had suffered. However, as she distractedly caressed her belly, feeling the movements of the baby inside her, Isabel couldn't help but wonder what lay behind Arthur Belmont's facade of arrogance and self-sufficiency, and why, despite all her defenses and her determination not to trust any man again, she found herself inexplicably intrigued by him. What do you think is the deeper reason behind Arthur's fascination with Isabel's pregnancy? Will Isabel let her guard down and reveal her vulnerabilities to him? Share your insights below. A secret shared the night had fallen over Belmont Manor, enveloping the property in a blanket of silence, barely interrupted by the soft rustle of the breeze through the garden trees. Arthur, unable to sleep, wandered through the deserted hallways when a beam of light from the kitchen caught his attention, drawing him like a moth to a flame. He stopped at the threshold, hidden by the shadows, observing Isabel, who, unaware of his presence, was talking on the phone in Portuguese in a low voice, yet filled with emotion. The intimacy of the moment told him he should withdraw, that he was violating her privacy, but something in Isabel's vulnerable tone, so different from the determination she displayed during the day, kept him motionless, listening to a conversation that was none of his business. "Sophia, I don't know what to do," he heard her say as she caressed her belly with circular motions. "Every day it's harder to maintain this facade of strength." With the phone nestled between her shoulder and cheek, Isabel poured herself a glass of water, continuing a conversation that seemed to be a continuation of many others with her best friend. "Yes, work is fine. My boss is complicated." She paused, as if carefully choosing her words. "Sometimes I think he sees beyond this belly, but other times he's so self-centered that I doubt he can see anything but his own reflection." A bitter laugh escaped her lips as she sat heavily on one of the kitchen stools, revealing a tiredness she didn't allow herself to show during her working hours. "What really worries me is Eduardo," she continued, after a deep sigh that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "He not only betrayed me when I needed him most, when we found out about the baby, but now he wants to come back as if nothing happened." The exhaustion in her voice transformed into indignation as she revealed how her ex-husband had abandoned her upon learning of the pregnancy, refusing to take on his role as a father, and disappearing without a trace. The worst part is that now, after months of not hearing from him, he suddenly shows up with messages and calls, insisting he wants a second chance, that he's changed, that he wants to be part of the baby's life. Arthur felt a wave of irrational rage take hold of him, a protective and possessive feeling he had no right to experience, but which emerged from the deepest part of his being. His fingers tightened around the glass of whiskey he held, with such intensity that, for a moment, he feared the glass would shatter under the pressure. The idea that someone had betrayed Isabel at her most vulnerable moment, that they had abandoned her while pregnant, only to pretend to return as if nothing had happened, was incomprehensibly cruel to him, awakening an indignation he couldn't remember ever feeling for someone else's problems. He stealthily withdrew before being discovered, but the revelations of that night stayed with him, swirling in his mind as he stared at his bedroom ceiling, unable to sleep. The image of Isabel, vulnerable and hurt, contrasted painfully with the strong, defiant woman he knew. And for the first time, Arthur wondered how much effort it cost her to maintain that facade of invulnerability, how much pain she hid behind her apparent strength. In the solitude of his room, he had to admit that what he felt for her had ceased to be mere curiosity or physical attraction. There was something more, something he couldn't name, but which grew day by day, transforming him in ways he never would have imagined. The next morning brought with it the usual routine, but Arthur couldn't get the conversation he had overheard out of his head. He watched Isabel move about the kitchen with the same efficiency as always, wondering how she could carry so much weight alone. Breakfast passed in the usual silence until Arthur, unable to contain himself any longer, uttered the words he had been mentally rehearsing all night. "Your ex is a coward." The cup Isabel held stopped halfway to her lips, her dark eyes fixed on him, with a mixture of surprise and indignation, understanding immediately that he had overheard her private conversation. "And you think you're better than him just because you're rich?" she retorted in a glacial tone, the vulnerability of the previous night completely absent, replaced by a defensive wall that Arthur had involuntarily helped reinforce with his intrusion. The silence fell between them like an iron curtain, heavy and impenetrable, as Arthur desperately searched for an answer he couldn't find, because for the first time in his life, he didn't have a sarcastic retort ready on the tip of his tongue. The confrontation ended as abruptly as it had begun, with Isabel retreating to the pantry on the pretext of looking for ingredients for the meal, leaving Arthur alone with his thoughts and his coffee cooling in front of him. That afternoon, in an unusual gesture, Arthur canceled all his meetings and remained at the mansion, wandering through spaces he didn't normally frequent, as if hoping to run into Isabel by chance, eager to repair the damage caused, but unsure how to do it. He finally found her in the backyard, sitting on a stone bench under an ancient elm tree, her eyes closed and her face turned towards the afternoon sun. An image of peace that contrasted with the inner storm Arthur knew she was going through. He approached cautiously, aware that he was not welcome, but unable to stay away, stopping at a prudent distance when she opened her eyes and looked at him without surprise, as if she had sensed his presence long before seeing him. "I'm sorry," he said simply, 2 words he rarely uttered, but which at that moment seemed the only appropriate ones. He shouldn't have listened to her private conversation or mentioned it afterwards. A sigh escaped Isabel's lips as she assessed his apology, her eyes scrutinizing his face as if searching for signs of falsehood or manipulation. "Everyone makes mistakes, Mr. Belmont," she finally replied, her voice softer than before, but still cautious. "Arthur," he corrected, surprising himself with the implicit request to remove that formal barrier between them. "My name is Arthur." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable like that of the morning, but expectant, laden with unexpressed possibilities and a mutual understanding that was slowly beginning to form. Isabel nodded almost imperceptibly, accepting his offer without committing him with words, and then returned her attention to the garden, to the flowers that were beginning to close with the arrival of dusk. Arthur sat beside her, maintaining a respectful but close distance, and together they watched the sunset in a shared silence that said more than any conversation, while in both of them grew the certainty that something fundamental had changed between them, something neither of them could define, but which they also couldn't ignore. What do you think will happen when Arthur confesses his feelings for Isabel? Will she finally let down her guard and allow herself to trust him again? Share your predictions below. A leap of faith. The rain lashed furiously against the windows of Belmont Manor, turning the garden into a misty, melancholic landscape that seemed to reflect the mood of its inhabitants. Isabel had spent the entire day preparing an elaborate banquet for a business dinner Arthur was hosting that night. Tiredness was etched in her every move as she put away the last utensils, her back tense from hours of standing, and her swollen feet protesting under the weight of her increasingly prominent belly. Thunder rumbled in the distance, echoing the exhaustion she felt inside. But she refused to show weakness, while the guests still lingered in the main dining room, their voices and laughter muffled as they reached the kitchen. She allowed herself a brief moment of rest, sitting on a stool by the central island, closing her eyes and gently massaging her lower back, where the pain had settled as a constant reminder of her condition. So engrossed was she in her discomfort that she didn't hear approaching footsteps, startling when the kitchen door opened to reveal Arthur, who had discreetly left his guests to find her. "You should rest," he said in a tone he intended to be authoritative, but which revealed genuine concern, his eyes scanning Isabel's exhausted figure with a gaze that had lost its usual coldness. Before she could respond with her accustomed independence, Arthur walked towards the teapot, and in a gesture that momentarily left her speechless, began to prepare tea with clumsy but determined movements, evidencing his lack of experience in domestic tasks. The silence between them lingered, but it was no longer the tense silence of their first encounters, but something more comfortable, as if they had reached a tacit truce that allowed them to share the space without the constant need to measure strength. "I've never made tea for anyone," Arthur confessed, as he awkwardly placed a steaming mug in front of her, an admission that seemed insignificant, but which revealed more about him than any expensive gift. Isabel took the mug in her hands, grateful for the warmth that spread through her numb fingers, curiously observing this man, who seemed so different from the arrogant millionaire she had met weeks ago. "Thank you," she murmured, allowing herself for the first time to let down her guard in front of him, too tired to maintain the facade of self-sufficiency that had been her armor for so long. Arthur sat opposite her, contemplating the rain through the windows, his aristocratic profile silhouetted against the stormy background, while his guests continued their celebration, oblivious to this moment of intimacy unfolding in the kitchen. "I must confess something," he said after a contemplative silence, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside, as if it were easier to speak without directly meeting her gaze. "I had never before met a pregnant woman up close," he continued, surprising himself with this revelation that exposed a vulnerability he didn't usually allow himself to show. His fingers nervously played with the rim of his own mug, an unconscious gesture that betrayed the discomfort he felt in admitting something so personal, so far removed from the image of absolute control he usually projected. "Never?" Isabel asked, surprise momentarily softening her features, causing Arthur to look up and meet her gaze. "My social circle doesn't usually include families or children," he explained with a bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose that says a lot about the kind of life I've led until now." A thoughtful silence fell between them, as the rain redoubled its intensity against the windows, creating an intimate bubble that seemed to isolate them from the rest of the world. Arthur's hand moved instinctively, as if it had a will of its own, stopping inches from Isabel's belly before abruptly withdrawing it, embarrassed by an impulse he didn't understand. She watched him with a mixture of curiosity and something harder to define, before gently taking his hand and guiding it to her belly, allowing him to feel the movements of the baby inside her. Amazement transformed Arthur's face when he felt the soft flutter beneath his palm, a life manifesting with determination, making its presence undeniable through Isabel's taut skin. His hand remained there longer than either expected, connecting him with something primary and essential he had never experienced, awakening in him emotions he didn't know he could feel. Minutes passed in a silence full of meaning, while outside the storm began to abate, as if nature itself respected the transcendence of the moment they shared. When Arthur finally withdrew his hand, his face had subtly changed. There was a softness in his features that Isabel hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that made him seem more human, more accessible. Isabel's gaze softened for the first time since she met him, allowing her to see beyond his defenses, recognizing in him something that resonated with her own loneliness, with her own need for connection. "How does it feel?" Arthur asked with genuine curiosity, his voice softer than it had ever been, devoid of the sarcasm that usually served as his shield against the world. "Like I'm never alone," she replied, after a moment of reflection, her fingers unconsciously tracing circles on her belly, where moments before his hand had rested. "Sometimes it's terrifying, other times it's the only comfort I have," she continued, surprising herself with this confession she hadn't shared with anyone else. The wall clock relentlessly marked the passage of time, reminding them that this interlude of intimacy couldn't last, that a world of obligations and expectations awaited outside. But something fundamental had changed between them. A bridge had been built over the chasm that separated them, and both knew, though they didn't express it in words, that they could no longer return to the formal distance they had maintained until then. "You should go back to your guests," Isabel finally said, breaking the spell that seemed to have enveloped them, returning them to the reality of their respective positions. Arthur nodded, but didn't move immediately, as if a part of him resisted abandoning this space of authenticity they had created together. "Thank you for the tea," she added with a small smile that illuminated her tired face, softening her features and revealing a beauty that went beyond the physical. He finally stood, But before leaving, he paused at the threshold, turning to her with an expression Isabel couldn't interpret, as if he wanted to say something more, but couldn't find the words. The moment passed, and Arthur returned to his role as host, leaving Isabel alone with her thoughts and the disturbing certainty that Arthur Belmont was changing. Or perhaps even more unsettling, that she was beginning to see the real man behind the millionaire's facade, and what she saw was dangerously attractive. What do you think is the future of Arthur and Isabel's relationship? Will their growing connection lead to something more, despite the challenges? Share your predictions below. A new chapter begins. The lights in the ballroom shimmered like artificial stars as the city's elite gathered for the most exclusive charity gala of the year. Arthur Belmont moved through the space with the confidence his position afforded him, occasionally pausing to greet other magnates and influential politicians. He had insisted that Isabel accompany him, not as his cook, but as a guest, a request she reluctantly accepted. Advanced in her pregnancy, Isabel stood out among the excessively thin and elegant women, her midnight blue dress chosen to accommodate her belly without sacrificing elegance. Arthur couldn't help but constantly seek her out with his gaze as he fulfilled his social obligations, feeling a strange mix of pride and possessiveness when he saw her conversing. What neither suspected was that their joint presence had not gone unnoticed by the scandal-hungry photographers who captured every gesture that could be misinterpreted. The next day, a picture of Arthur with his hand resting on the back of a beautiful pregnant woman graced the front page of a tabloid, accompanied by a headline implying that the most coveted bachelor was about to become a father. The article presented Isabel as the millionaire's secret lover, suggesting that her hiring as a cook was a cover-up to keep the relationship from public scrutiny. Arthur's phone didn't stop ringing, inundated with messages and calls from people demanding explanations. His mother, an aristocratic woman for whom appearances were everything, was the first to show up unannounced, her heels clattering like gunshots on the marble as she advanced towards her son's office. The family meeting that followed was tense, with his father joining via video conference, both parents alternating between reproaches for his supposed irresponsibility and strategies to minimize the impact on the company's reputation. What surprised Arthur most was his own reluctance to deny the rumors, as if a part of him found a certain pleasure in the idea of being considered the father of Isabel's child. Meanwhile, Isabel discovered the scandal in the most humiliating way, through the glances and whispers of the mansion staff. It was the housekeeper who finally showed her the newspaper with trembling hands, preparing her for the blow she was about to receive. Isabel looked at the photograph with growing disbelief and horror, recognizing herself next to Arthur in a moment that had seemed innocent but which, captured and taken out of context, told a completely different story. The article's insinuations hit her like slaps, suggesting she was a social climber who had seduced her boss to secure a life of luxury, that the pregnancy was a calculated stroke of luck. Humiliation quickly gave way to indignation, and indignation to a cold fury that prompted her to seek out Arthur, finding him in his office after his parents left, his pale face revealing that the family encounter had not been pleasant. "I am not a whim for you," Isabel snapped without preamble, throwing the newspaper onto the desk, where it landed with an accusatory thud. "I don't want your pity or your protection, nor for people to think I'm your latest charity project," she continued, words flowing like a torrent, releasing all the accumulated frustration, not only from the scandal, but from the inexplicable evolution of her feelings toward him. Arthur watched her in silence, allowing her to vent, his expression unreadable, but his eyes more vulnerable than she had ever seen. "I've worked my whole life to be respected for my talent, not for who I date or who the father of my child is." Her voice broke slightly, betraying the emotion overwhelming her, despite her efforts to maintain composure. Everything I've achieved has been through my own effort, and now this damn article reduces me to the millionaire's pregnant mistress, as if I were nothing more than an accessory in your life. Arthur found himself strangely defensive, an unfamiliar position for someone accustomed to dictating the rules. "I didn't ask for this," he finally replied, his voice softer than usual, almost conciliatory. "We'll deny everything. We'll clarify that you're just my cook, and that the pregnancy has nothing to do with me," he continued, the correct words coming out of his mouth, while a part of him rebelled against them. Isabel's reaction to the mention of being merely his cook did not go unnoticed. A slight hardening in her expression, a shadow of disappointment that crossed her eyes, revealing that the evolution of their feelings was not unilateral. Silence settled between them, laden with unexpressed emotions and a mutual understanding that both resisted acknowledging, that somehow they had transcended the employer-employee relationship to enter a more complex territory, a territory for which neither was prepared. The sound of the phone finally broke the tension, bringing Arthur back to the reality of the crisis he had to manage. "I'll make this disappear," he said, as Isabel headed towards the door, emotionally and physically exhausted. "I promise you, no one will bother you again with speculations about us." She stopped at the threshold, her profile silhouetted against the hallway light, one hand resting on her belly, while the other clung to the door frame. She remained there for a moment, without turning, perhaps because she didn't want him to see the confusion on her face, the internal struggle between the relief that the situation would be resolved and the strange disappointment at how easily Arthur seemed willing to dismiss any connection between them. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely audible, before disappearing down the hallway, leaving Arthur alone with the unsettling feeling that, for the first time in his life, he was letting go of something truly valuable, something money couldn't buy. What do you think will be the final outcome of this misunderstanding and betrayal? Will Arthur fight for Isabel beyond the scandal, or will they part ways permanently? Share your predictions below. A love forged in fire. A week had passed since the tabloid scandal, and life at Belmont Manor attempted to return to an apparent normalcy, though the tension between Arthur and Isabel remained like an undercurrent neither dared to address directly. Official denials had been published, explanations provided, and media interest began to wane with the emergence of new, juicier scandals that captured the public's volatile attention. Arthur had immersed himself in work with renewed intensity, as if contracts and meetings could keep at bay those disturbing thoughts that assaulted him in moments of quiet. Those moments when he found himself wondering what it would be like if the rumors were true, if he really were the one expecting a child with Isabel. The distance between them had widened, with interactions limited to strictly professional matters. Brief encounters in the kitchen where conversations went no further than menus and schedules, as if both had tacitly agreed to pretend that moments of closeness had never existed. But even in that estrangement, there was a painful intimacy, a silent recognition of what could have been, but which both feared too much to explore. He for fear of the vulnerability he had never allowed himself. She for fear of being hurt again by a man who could abandon her as easily as her child's father had. The main doorbell unexpectedly resonated mid-afternoon, interrupting the mansion's tranquility with its insistent summons, a sound that seemed out of place on a day when Arthur expected no visitors, and most staff were busy with their daily tasks. Isabel, returning from the garden with some fresh herbs for dinner, found herself closest to the entrance and, moved by habit more than obligation, went to open the door, never imagining that this simple act would alter the fragile balance she had managed to establish in her life. The man waiting on the other side was painfully familiar. Edward, her ex-husband, elegantly dressed and holding a bouquet of lilies, her favorite flowers, a detail that evidenced his intention to impress her with this demonstration that he still remembered her tastes. Initial shock quickly gave way to a mix of contradictory emotions that swirled within her. Indignation at his audacity to show up unannounced after having abandoned her, confusion at the unexpected appearance, and an instinctive fear that his presence would destabilize the new life she had begun to build for herself and her son. "What are you doing here?" she finally asked, her voice firmer than she felt, one hand instinctively protective over her belly, while the other clung to the doorframe, as if seeking physical support against the emotional impact of seeing him again after so many months. "I came to see you, to talk to you," Edward replied with that charming smile that had once quickened her heart, but which now only aroused suspicion, his eyes quickly assessing the mansion's luxurious surroundings before refocusing on her advanced pregnancy that made it impossible to ignore the time elapsed since their separation. "I've been thinking a lot about you, about us, about the baby. I made a terrible mistake by leaving like that, but I was scared, confused," he continued, his voice modulated in that persuasive tone Isabel remembered well, the same one he used in his moments of weakness to convince her to forgive his multiple indiscretions. She remained silent, evaluating his words, searching for sincerity in his eyes, but finding only the reflection of her own past hopes, those she had buried painfully after his abandonment. What Edward didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Arthur was watching the scene from the side hallway, drawn by the unknown male voice that had interrupted the mansion's usual silence, an involuntary witness to a reunion that awakened in him a primitive feeling of territoriality that surprised him by its intensity. "I've changed, Isabel," Edward insisted, taking a step forward as if to shorten the physical distance between them, a movement she countered, instinctively stepping back. "I want to be part of our child's life. I want us to try again, to be a family." The conversation moved to the backyard, where privacy allowed them to talk without the discomfort of remaining at the entrance, though for Isabel, every word exchanged was like walking barefoot on broken glass, painful but necessary to definitively close that chapter of her life. Arthur had discreetly withdrawn to his study, but his mind couldn't concentrate on the documents in front of him, too busy imagining the conversation unfolding in the garden, the arguments that man would be using to win Isabel back, the possibility that she might decide to give him a second chance, that she might choose her child's biological father over what exactly? Arthur couldn't define what he offered, what he felt, what he desired from her. But he knew with a certainty that frightened him that the idea of losing her was unbearable. The sound of raised voices interrupted his thoughts, drawing him back to the window, from where he could observe the garden without being seen. He witnessed the moment when Isabel, with a dignity Arthur found admirable, finally confronted her ex-husband with the truth they both knew, but which only she had the courage to speak aloud. "You haven't come back for me. You've come back because you can't stand to see me move on." The silence that followed her words was so thick, it seemed to have its own weight, hovering between them like an invisible yet tangible barrier that no argument could penetrate. Edward tried to protest, to minimize her accusations, to resort to promises and shared memories, but the determination in Isabel's eyes didn't waver, strengthened by months of personal rebuilding, of learning to value herself beyond the validation any man could offer her. The discussion continued for a few more minutes, but it was evident to any observer, and Arthur watched intently, that Edward had lost ground, that his arguments fell on ears no longer willing to listen to excuses or empty promises. When he finally left, defeated, and resentful. His departure had none of the drama he perhaps expected, but rather the quiet dignity of a chapter definitively closing, leaving Isabel in the garden, contemplating the flowers with an expression of relief and melancholy that reflected the emotional cost of that encounter, but also the liberation that came with having said everything she had kept inside for so long. Arthur emerged from his hiding place and walked towards her, driven by a need he didn't stop to analyze, simply following the instinct to be by her side in that moment of vulnerability. Isabel felt him approach before seeing him, recognizing his footsteps on the gravel path, but she didn't turn to him, allowing him that moment to decide what he would say, how he would act, what role he would choose to play in this new turn of events. "If he doesn't want this family, I do." The words burst from Arthur's lips almost without permission, soft but clear in the silence of the garden, surprising both him and her with their naked honesty, with the declaration of intentions they implied. Isabel slowly turned to look at him, her eyes searching his for confirmation that she had heard correctly, that she wasn't misinterpreting words spoken in a moment of emotional impulse. The silence between them was charged with unformulated questions, with uncertainties and possibilities, with a future they were just beginning to glimpse, but which already seemed more real, more tangible than anything they had experienced before. Isabel didn't reply immediately, not because she had no answer, but because the magnitude of what Arthur was offering, of what he was risking by uttering those words, required a consideration that went beyond the emotional reaction of the moment, a reflection on what she truly wanted for herself and her child, and whether Arthur Belmont, with all his complexities and contradictions, could truly be part of that future, or if he was just a passing impulse, a reaction to the drama he had just witnessed. What do you think will be the biggest challenge for Arthur and Isabel as they navigate this new potential relationship? Will Isabel's past trauma prevent her from fully trusting him? Share your thoughts below. Building a future. Brick by brick, the days following the confrontation in the garden unfolded in a strange emotional limbo, with Arthur and Isabel moving in cautious circles around each other, aware that something fundamental had shifted between them, but daring not to put it into words. Impulsive declarations in moments of emotion were one thing, but facing them in the light of day, incorporating them into daily reality, required a different kind of courage that neither seemed willing to display yet. In the mornings, they shared breakfast in a silence laden with meaning, exchanging glances that communicated more than any conversation, small gestures that revealed the growing intimacy between them. Arthur serving her tea without asking, Isabel instinctively preparing his coffee exactly as he liked it. Afternoons occasionally found them in the garden or the library, where Arthur would read aloud, while Isabel rested her swollen feet, an improvised domesticity neither had experienced before, but which both were beginning to crave with a disturbing intensity. Nights became the territory for deep conversations, those moments when darkness seemed to grant permission to reveal vulnerabilities hidden during the day, childhood stories, abandoned dreams, fears about the future, verbal constructions of a bridge slowly extending over the abyss that had separated them. It was during one of those nights, with the mansion silent around them, and only the soft ticking of the clock as a witness, when Arthur finally gathered the courage to approach Isabel in a way that transcended words. He found her in her room, standing by the window, contemplating the garden bathed in soft moonlight, an ethereal silhouette against the dark velvet of the curtains, more beautiful in her natural vulnerability than any artificially perfect woman he had known before. He stopped at the threshold, waiting to be invited in, respecting that private space that was hers by right, but which somehow felt sacred, like a temple only the truly devoted should access. Isabel turned upon sensing his presence, her eyes bright in the gloom, a mixture of expectation and fear reflected in them as she watched him slowly approach, as if giving him time to reject her, to set boundaries, to decide how far she would allow him to advance. Neither spoke when they finally stood face to face. Words seemed superfluous before the intensity of the moment, before the shared certainty that they stood on the edge of a precipice and that the next step would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. The kiss came as an inevitable conclusion, like the end of a sentence they had been building since that first encounter in the kitchen, an act as natural as breathing, but infinitely more significant in its simplicity. Arthur's lips found Isabel's with a tenderness that contradicted the public image of the ruthless businessman, revealing the vulnerable man who existed behind the mask of arrogance and self-sufficiency. She responded with an intensity that surprised both, as if in that contact she released months of repressed emotions, denied desires, feelings she had tried to rationalize, but which were too powerful to be contained by logic or prudence. For an eternal moment, the outside world vanished, reduced to the sensation of their lips joined, their breaths mingling, their hearts beating in perfect synchronicity that seemed to defy all the odds that had been against them from the beginning. When they finally separated, reality returned with painful clarity, bringing with it all the doubts and fears that had momentarily been silenced by the purity of that contact. It was Isabel who took the first step back, both physically and emotionally. A retreat Arthur felt as a physical blow, as a rejection he hadn't anticipated after the passionate response he had received. Fear seized her with paralyzing intensity, not the rational fear of the practical complications of a relationship with her boss, but the visceral, primitive fear of abandonment, of betrayal, of repeating the story she had so painfully lived. I can't fall in love with someone who might leave the next day. The words emerged brokenly, laden with an emotion that contradicted her apparent rejection, revealing that the problem was not a lack of feelings, but an excess of them. So much so that it terrified her. Her hands trembled slightly as she hugged herself, as if seeking protection against the vulnerability she felt, against the temptation to yield to that growing feeling that drew her towards Arthur despite all her defenses. His eyes, usually confident and dominating, now reflected an almost childlike uncertainty, a confusion at the unexpected turn events had taken, at the invisible but impenetrable barrier Isabel had just erected between them. Arthur remained silent, not from a lack of arguments, but because deep down he knew she was right. What guarantees could he offer her? He who had never maintained a relationship for more than a few months, who considered commitment a limitation to his freedom, who until meeting her had seen love as a weakness he couldn't afford. Isabel's words resonated in his mind with a painful truth. He could leave the next day, could get bored of playing family, could decide that the responsibility was too heavy for his shoulders, accustomed to the lightness of a life without ties. The certainty of what he felt for her violently clashed with the uncertainty of his ability to maintain that feeling long term, to make it the solid foundation she and her child needed and deserved. Finding no answer that could counter those legitimate fears, Arthur quietly retreated, taking with him the taste of her lips and the bitter understanding that for once in his life, getting what he wanted didn't depend on his wealth or power, but on his ability to fundamentally change, to become the kind of man who deserved the love and trust of a woman like Isabel. What do you think Arthur's parents' ultimatum will force him to do? Will he choose his family legacy or the chance for a real connection with Isabel? Share your predictions below. A defining choice. Arthur Belmont's study, normally a sanctuary of order and power, now reflected the inner chaos of its occupant. Documents scattered across the mahogany desk, his loosened tie hanging carelessly from his neck, and a glass of whiskey barely touched beside the framed photo of his parents, whose severe expressions seemed to silently judge him from the glass. 3 days had passed since the kiss and the subsequent rejection. 3 days in which Arthur had avoided any significant interaction with Isabel, seeking refuge in work and long meetings outside the manor, postponing a decision he knew was inevitable, but for which he felt unprepared. The manor had become an emotional minefield, with encounters carefully choreographed to avoid moments alone, conversations limited to strictly necessary topics, and a palpable tension that affected even the rest of the staff. That morning, however, the call from his father had changed everything, precipitating a confrontation Arthur had been avoiding his entire adult life, but which now seemed to be the necessary catalyst to clarify his own feelings. The news had spread like wildfire in business circles. Arthur Belmont, heir to the family empire, apparently romantically involved with his pregnant cook, whose child was of another man. A scandal that official denials had failed to completely quell, and which now threatened to affect critical negotiations for the company's international expansion. You either choose the family legacy, or you choose that woman. His father's voice, cold and calculating even through the distance of the video call, had delivered the ultimatum like someone discussing a simple business transaction, emotionless, with no room for negotiation. We have been patient, Arthur, waiting for you to get over this whim, but your behavior is affecting the company's public perception, and we cannot afford that luxury at this critical moment. The words had fallen like precise whips, designed to remind him of his place, his responsibilities, everything that was at stake, not just his personal fortune, but the legacy of generations, the work of his grandfather and father, the financial future of hundreds of employees who depended on the company's stability. His mother had then intervened, her tone softer, but equally relentless in its intention. You've always had your flings, dear, and we've never interfered. But this is different. That woman is expecting another man's child. Imagine the scandal if you were to continue this relationship. The virtual meeting had continued for almost an hour, a clinical dissection of the reasons why his interest in Isabel was inappropriate, imprudent, potentially disastrous for all involved. A constant reminder that Arthur Belmont was not simply a man, but a name, a brand, a responsibility to his ancestors and descendants. Now, hours after that conversation, Arthur gazed at the sunset from his study window, watching the sun slowly sink below the horizon, painting the sky in golden and crimson hues that seemed to reflect the inner battle he waged. His entire life had been defined by external expectations: the perfect son, the exemplary student, the worthy heir, the ruthless businessman, roles he had assumed with an ease he mistook for satisfaction, never questioning if it was what he truly desired or simply what was expected of him. Isabel had been the first person to see him as simply Arthur, not the Belmont surname or the fortune that accompanied him, the first to challenge him, to demand authenticity, to show him the possibility of a connection that transcended the superficialities that had dominated his previous relationships. Was he willing to give up everything he knew, the security of a path laid out for him, for the uncertainty of a feeling he was just beginning to understand? Was Isabel, was the possibility of a family with her and a child who didn't share his blood, worth the sacrifice of everything that had so far defined his identity? The answer came with a clarity that surprised him, not as a laboriously reached conclusion, but as a truth that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. For the first time in his life, Arthur knew exactly what he wanted, and it had nothing to do with his parents' approval or the social expectations that had always dictated his decisions. With a calm that contrasted with the inner storm of the previous days, he stood up and began to draft 2 letters. One for his parents, explaining his decision to temporarily step away from the family business to explore a personal path he had never allowed himself to contemplate. The other for his lawyer, instructing him on the transfer of certain personal assets that would allow him to support himself while he defined his next step. He wasn't completely renouncing his inheritance. He wasn't naive enough to believe that money didn't matter. But he was establishing, perhaps for the first time, that there were things more valuable than bank accounts and business shares, priorities that transcended the financial balance sheet that had hitherto been the only measure of success he knew. With the letters completed and the necessary arrangements underway, Arthur left his study, walking with a determined stride, searching for Isabel throughout the mansion, surprised when the housekeeper informed him that she had left early for a medical appointment. He didn't remember being on her schedule. Without thinking twice, he grabbed his car keys and drove towards the clinic where he knew Isabel received prenatal care, driving through the city traffic with an urgency that didn't correspond to any real emergency, but to the newfound certainty that every moment apart was a lost moment, a wasted opportunity to show her that her fear of abandonment, though understandable, was baseless when it came to him. As he approached the clinic, the magnitude of what he was about to do hit him hard. He was about to commit not only to a woman, but to a future that included a child who was not his own, responsibilities for which he had no experience, a life radically different from the one he had always known. But instead of terrifying him, as it would have just a few weeks ago, the prospect filled him with an almost childlike anticipation, an eagerness to discover facets of himself he had never explored, to build something meaningful that didn't depend on his surname, but on his actions, on his choices, on his ability to love and be loved, not for what he possessed, but for who he was. The traffic finally cleared, allowing him to reach the clinic just as Isabel was leaving the main doors, her figure unmistakable even from a distance, one hand resting protectively on her belly, while with the other she held what appeared to be ultrasound images, photographic paper treasures that held the image of the being soon to arrive in the world. Arthur stopped the car and got out hastily, calling her name with a voice that resonated in the parking lot, attracting her attention and that of several passers-by who curiously observed the scene beginning to unfold. The elegant businessman running towards the pregnant woman, the surprise and confusion on her face, the contrast between their worlds, seemingly irreconcilable, but which at that moment converged at a point of possibility, in the promise of a new beginning that depended solely on both their courage to accept it. Sauce, what do you think Isabel's reaction will be to Arthur's grand gesture? Will she accept his commitment, or will her past fears hold her back? Share your predictions below. The unspoken promise. When they finally stood face to face, the words Arthur had mentally rehearsed throughout the drive vanished, replaced by the simplicity of a truth that needed no embellishments. I choose you. I choose you. The clinic's waiting room had become the unexpected stage for a moment that would change their lives forever, with the curious glances of other patients as silent witnesses to the intensity vibrating between them. Isabel watched Arthur with a mixture of disbelief and caution, his words, I choose you, resonating in her mind like a persistent echo that defied all her carefully constructed defenses. Her hands clutched the ultrasound images she had just received, photographic treasures that captured the first real image of her child, an intimate and deeply personal moment that now, somehow, included the man in front of her. What are you doing here, Arthur? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, fearful of the answer, but unable not to seek it, caught between the desire to believe in what his words offered and the deep-seated fear of being abandoned again, when the reality of fatherhood became too overwhelming. The doctor emerged at that moment from her office, unintentionally interrupting the answer Arthur was about to give, her professional expression softening as she recognized Isabel. "Everything all right? You forgot your next appointment," she mentioned, extending a card with the date and time noted, her eyes passing with professional curiosity from Isabel to Arthur and back again, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, but remaining discreetly apart. "It's for the next ultrasound, the one at 32 weeks. It's important that you don't miss it," she added kindly, her words directed at Isabel, but her gaze subtly including Arthur, as if sensing the role he was beginning to take in her patient's life. "We'll be there," Arthur replied without hesitation, surprising both Isabel and himself with the naturalness with which he assumed a responsibility he had until recently considered alien to his life. The doctor nodded with a professional smile, bidding them farewell with a gesture before attending to her next patient, leaving them alone again amidst the controlled bustle of the clinic. "Can we talk in a more private place?" Arthur asked, aware of the glances occasionally directed at them, of the whispers that followed them, in a space too public for the conversation they needed to have. Isabel hesitated for a moment, torn between the prudence that advised her to maintain emotional distance and the irresistible curiosity to understand what had brought Arthur there, what that choice he proclaimed to have made truly meant. Finally, she nodded, allowing him to guide her towards the exit with a hand lightly resting on her lower back, a protective gesture that felt simultaneously new and familiar, as if their bodies remembered the contact their minds still questioned. The car ride passed in a silence laden with expectations and unformulated questions, with the city parading through the windows as an indifferent backdrop to the personal drama unfolding inside the vehicle. Contrary to what Isabel expected, Arthur did not drive them back to the manor, but to a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, a green, open space where families strolled carefree and children played under the watchful eyes of their parents. "My father gave me an ultimatum this morning," Arthur began, as they walked slowly along a path lined with ancient trees, their leaves creating dancing patterns of light and shadow over them. "The family legacy or you, as if it were a simple equation, a purely financial decision," he continued, his voice mixing the bitterness of someone who belatedly discovers a painful truth with the liberation of someone who finally breaks invisible but suffocating chains. Isabel listened in silence, processing the weight of his words, gradually understanding the magnitude of the conflict Arthur faced, the family and social pressures against which he was now rebelling. "Throughout my life, I've been what others expected me to be, the perfect son, the ideal heir, the ruthless businessman. Roles I accepted without question because they were comfortable, because they came with privileges and power." His gaze momentarily drifted into the distance, towards the children playing, oblivious to the complexities of the adult world, with a freedom he had never truly known. "But then you arrived, with your belly and your independence, and your way of looking at me as if my millions meant absolutely nothing, as if you could see through all the layers of Arthur Belmont, to find simply Arthur, a man I didn't even truly know myself." They stopped in front of a small pond where ducks swam lazily, oblivious to the human drama unfolding a few feet from them. "When my father presented me with that ultimatum, I expected to feel trapped, divided. But instead, I experienced a clarity I had never known before," Arthur continued, turning to look directly at her, allowing her to see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he had never before shown anyone. "For the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I wanted, without doubts, without calculations. I chose you, Isabel, Not because it's the right thing to do, or the sensible thing, or the expected thing, but because the alternative, a life without you, without the possibility of us, is simply no longer acceptable to me. His words floated between them, laden with a raw honesty that defied any attempt to trivialize them or dismiss their impact, demanding to be taken with the same seriousness with which they had been uttered. Isabel felt the weight of his gaze, the intensity of his declaration, and something within her, that protective wall she had built after Edward's abandonment, began to crack, not crumbling completely, but allowing a glimpse of the possibility of trusting again, of opening herself to a future that included this man, who was apparently willing to sacrifice everything he knew for her, and a child who hadn't even been born yet. "May I?" Arthur asked softly, extending a trembling hand towards the ultrasound images Isabel still held, a gesture that symbolized much more than simple curiosity, that represented his desire to be included in this fundamental part of her life. She nodded slowly, handing him the photographs carefully, observing with a mixture of tenderness and awe the reverence with which he received them, as if he held something infinitely precious and fragile. Arthur's eyes swept over the black and white images, gradually deciphering the nebulous shapes until he distinguished the tiny profile, the little hands clenched into fists, the curve of a minuscule back, a human being in formation, complete in its essence, but still developing, totally dependent on its mother, but already with an identity of its own that would soon manifest in the world. "He's perfect," he murmured, his voice choked, overwhelmed by an emotion he hadn't anticipated, by an instant connection with this life that didn't share his blood, but which in some inexplicable way he already felt as part of his responsibility, his future, his heart. Isabel observed the transformation in his face, the genuine astonishment, the complete vulnerability, and something definitive changed within her, a certainty that settled in her chest. This was not a fleeting whim for Arthur, not a game or a phase. It was a conscious choice, a commitment he was making with full knowledge of what it meant. The world seemed to stop momentarily as they looked at each other, the barriers finally broken down, complete honesty between them, for the first time since they met. "I want to be there," Arthur said, with a quiet but unbreakable determination, carefully returning the images, but keeping his gaze fixed on her. "For the next ultrasound, for the birth, for the first steps, for everything, if you'll allow me." It was a request, not an imposition, an offer, not a demand. A man asking for the opportunity to demonstrate with actions what his words promised, aware that trust could not be demanded, but earned day by day, decision by decision, promise fulfilled after promise fulfilled. Isabel took his hands in hers, a simple but deeply significant gesture, the first physical step towards accepting what he offered, towards the possibility of a shared future that neither would have imagined when she first crossed the threshold of Belmont Manor. "One step at a time," she replied, her eyes bright with contained tears, not of sadness, but of a cautious hope that was beginning to blossom, starting with that next ultrasound. It wasn't a resounding yes. It wasn't a promise of a guaranteed happy ending. It was a door ajar, an invitation to prove that words could become actions, that intentions could manifest in constant commitment, that love, because that was what was beginning to grow between them, though they didn't yet name it, could be stronger than fear and more lasting than the pain of the past. How do you think Arthur and Isabel will navigate their new, unconventional relationship? Will their love be strong enough to overcome past traumas and societal expectations? Share your thoughts below. A home forged in love. The afternoon light gently fell upon Isabel's small apartment, bathing it in golden hues that filtered through the white curtains, swaying in the spring breeze. 3 weeks had passed since that encounter at the clinic. 3 weeks of dizzying changes that had completely restructured both their lives. Arthur had left the family manor to temporarily settle in a nearby hotel, refusing to pressure Isabel, but staying close enough to demonstrate his commitment with daily actions. Isabel had returned to her modest apartment, reclaiming her independence, not as a rejection of Arthur, but as an affirmation of her identity beyond the relationship she was beginning to build with him. The physical distance, far from separating them, had strengthened their connection, eliminating the complications of the employer-employee dynamic and allowing them to truly get to know each other as equals, as two adults exploring the possibility of a shared future without the shadow of work obligations or distorted expectations. Every morning, Arthur appeared with breakfast and different flowers, then accompanied her to her medical appointments, helped her prepare the baby's room, patiently and consistently establishing the routine of someone who plans to stay, who builds foundations for something lasting instead of fleeting castles in the air. For Isabel, those 3 weeks had been a revelation, observing how this man she once considered superficial and self-centered gradually transformed into the attentive and committed partner she never thought possible to find, especially in these circumstances. The doorbell resonated in the apartment, interrupting Isabel's thoughts as she placed the finishing touches on the simple but elegantly set dinner table, a role reversal that symbolized how much their dynamic had changed. Now she was cooking for him, not out of obligation, but by choice. Not as an employee, but as a woman who found pleasure in sharing her talent with someone who genuinely appreciated it. Arthur appeared at the threshold with a bouquet of white camellias, her favorite flower, as he had discovered in one of their long night conversations. Dressed simply, but with the natural elegance that characterized him, even when trying to adapt to a less ostentatious environment than he had known his whole life. "It smells wonderful," he commented as he entered, gently kissing her cheek in a gesture that had become familiar, but which still caused a flutter in Isabel's stomach, a reaction she attributed to pregnancy hormones, but which she secretly knew was something deeper, more significant. The apartment, small but cozy, had become the setting for a growing intimacy between them, a neutral space where neither had an advantage over the other, where both were simply Arthur and Isabel, free from the burdens and expectations that their respective pasts imposed. Dinner passed amidst light conversation and shared laughter, with the comfort of those who have found a safe haven in each other, a space where they can be authentic without fear of judgment or rejection, gradually building the trust that Isabel's previous abandonment had so completely shattered. "There's something I want to talk to you about," Arthur finally said when they finished dessert, his tone serious but warm, causing an instant of unease in Isabel, a conditioned reflex from past experiences where serious conversations had preceded devastating disappointments. Noticing her tension, he gently took her hand across the table, a reassuring gesture that communicated more than any word his intention to stay, to build rather than destroy. "These past few days with you, seeing how you prepare for your child's arrival, how you face each challenge with that silent strength that characterizes you, have made me realize something I perhaps always knew, but had never been brave enough to admit." His eyes, usually controlled and calculating in his business interactions, now revealed an absolute vulnerability, a raw honesty that Isabel had learned to recognize as his true essence. Not the arrogant mask he showed to the world, but the sensitive man who existed behind carefully constructed defenses. "You were right to distrust, to fear that I might leave the next day, The Arthur you first met probably would have. He would have run at the first real difficulty, at the first demand of genuine commitment. The admission floated between them, not as a confirmation of her fears, but as a recognition of growth, of a transformation that both had witnessed and nurtured during these weeks of mutual rediscovery. But that Arthur no longer exists, he continued, each word loaded with the quiet determination of someone who has reached a fundamental truth after much reflection. In his place is this man who cannot imagine a day without hearing your laugh, without seeing you caress your belly while humming lullabies in Portuguese, without the possibility of being part of this family you are creating. From his pocket, he pulled out not a ring, not a jewel or material object that could be interpreted as an attempt to buy affection or commitment, but a simple key, unadorned yet infinitely significant in the context of their shared history. It's the key to a house, he explained at Isabel's questioning gaze. Not a pretentious mansion like the one you knew, but a real home, with a garden for the baby to play, with a spacious kitchen where you can experiment, with room to grow together if you decide. The implicit proposal in that small metallic object was clear, but without pressure. An invitation not to depend on him, but to build with him, respecting her autonomy, her independent identity, offering her not paternalistic protection, but equal partnership. I'm not asking for an immediate answer, he added quickly, sensing the mix of emotions crossing Isabel's expressive face. I just want you to know that I have chosen, and always will choose, to be by your side and your child's, not as a savior, nor as a substitute father figure, but as a partner on this journey, if you accept me. The words hung between them, laden with promises not based on romantic fantasies, but on the practical and emotional reality they had built together during these weeks, on the small daily actions that demonstrated commitment more eloquently than any grandiloquent declaration. Isabel gazed at the key, feeling its weight not just physically, but symbolically. All it represented, all it could be if she dared to take this step, to trust again after the profound pain she had experienced. She thought of Edward and his betrayal, of the loneliness of the first months of pregnancy, of the constant fear that had been her companion ever since. But she also thought of Arthur faithfully appearing every morning, holding her hand during ultrasounds, learning about fetal development and labor-breathing techniques. All those small daily demonstrations that accumulated outweighed any residual doubt. The decision crystallized within her with a certainty that surprised her by its clarity and forcefulness. This man, so different from the one she had initially known, deserved a chance, deserved her trust not as a gift, but as recognition of the path they had walked together. I choose you too, she finally replied, taking the key and with it accepting not only the physical proposal of a shared home, but also the emotional promise of a future built by two, a mutual commitment based not on need or convenience, but on conscious and free choice. Arthur's face lit up with a joy so pure, so genuine, that it dispelled any lingering doubt Isabel might harbor. This was not a whim or a fleeting fancy. It was the recognition that they had found something unique in each other, something that transcended circumstances and expectations, something that deserved to be protected and nurtured. He leaned towards her, closing the distance between them, kissing her with a tenderness that communicated everything words couldn't adequately express, his hand resting naturally on her belly, while his lips sealed a promise that both knew would last much longer than any legal contract or formal ceremony. Months later, as they held little Leo, named in honor of Isabel's paternal grandfather, Together in the hospital room flooded with morning light, Arthur fully grasped the magnitude of the gift he had received. Not only the love of an extraordinary woman, but the opportunity to be part of this new life, of this tiny yet complete being, who looked at him with curious eyes, as if evaluating the man who, without sharing his blood, had chosen to be his father in all the ways that truly mattered. "Some recipes call for time," Isabel murmured, with a tired but radiant smile, as she watched the interaction between the two men in her life. "But the best ones are always worth the wait." Arthur smiled at the culinary metaphor so typical of her, perfectly understanding its meaning. Their love story had been neither conventional nor simple. It had required patience and adjustments, moments of doubt and acts of faith. But the result, this improvised but more real family than anything else in his experience, was infinitely more satisfying than any business success or material achievement he had pursued in his previous life. In Isabel's eyes, he found the reflection of his own future, one no longer defined by external expectations or family traditions, but by his own choices, by the courage to have dared to reject the established path to build something authentic, something that finally allowed him to be not the Belmont heir, but simply Arthur, a man who had found his purpose not in accumulating wealth, but in cultivating love. And so concludes our story of the millionaire and the cook. Did you enjoy it? Where are you listening from? Do you identify with Arthur, with Isabel, or perhaps with any other character? Tell us in the comments. Remember that liking and subscribing costs absolutely nothing and helps our channel grow enormously. You don't need to fill out any forms. Just click the like and subscribe buttons. If you liked this unconventional love story, share it with someone you think would also enjoy it. Every week, we bring new stories especially for you. Thanks for joining us on this journey. See you in the next story.